Okay, welcome back. And this is chapter 5, Pancritical Rationalism, which is the chapter that the whole thing hinges on, really. So let's jump into it. The last time we chatted a week or so ago, I finished off talking about how Bartley really looked at the whole philosophical enterprise, how he saw it, including critical rationalism. And he saw it as being authoritarian in nature. Now, critical rationalism is an improvement on much else that came. But he thought even in its most liberal of forms, the way to understand philosophical tradition is just like that. It is an authoritarian structure. And worse, it has a mistake at the heart of it, which is when one authoritarian structure is left behind and abandoned, we tend to celebrate it as a move from irrationality to rationality. And when Bartley sees this, he's seeing it's simply a move from one authoritarian structure to another authoritarian structure. Always in the same vein, always with what's been left behind labeled irrational and what we are now holding as rational. So one is justified in terms of the other. One is wrong because it doesn't live up to the new standard. Each new philosophical revolution that came along decided that the previous candidate in that whole system was unsatisfactory. So they come along and they propose a new standard, a new movement, and the new one is rational. And so the enterprise continues. Bartley puts here that the church is replaced by intellectual intuition. Intellectual intuition is then replaced by sensory experience. Sensory experience replaced by language systems, and there's various of them. And onwards and onwards. And I don't know if this is Bartley who says this first. He seems to indicate it here, but it may be him, it may be Popper. I suppose it doesn't really matter. They both agreed upon this particular point, which is there are questions out there. Questions that as soon as you ask them, you are begging an authoritarian answer. Questions like how do you know? Or how do you justify your beliefs? Or with what do you guarantee your opinions? There's no way to answer these things without being authoritarian. They all beg the answer for themselves. You have to resort to a justification. And once you've done that, you're back in authoritarianism. The game being played there is to find an infallible epistemological source. And of course, the whole enterprise, if you're a critical rationalist, is to exercise ourselves from this inclination and to show all the difficulties involved in that, or the impossibilities. Let's move this into the political scene where I think this tends to make most sense. So the question, who should rule, is a fairly common one. I think most people ask it about themselves when they're looking even with inside a democracy at who they should pick. They think who should be the ruler, who should be in charge. A very similar question, asked in a slightly different tone, is what is the supreme political authority? Now, the answer to this has to be some sort of infallible source. Who should rule? Well, once you've collected this person, once you've decided who should rule or what that political source should be, you've forfeited your rights. They are by definition more important than you. They know more than you, and they're in the position of power. Now, move it however you like. It could be that the people are who you want to rule, or the proletariat, or the king, or the dictator. Political authority, it's often argued, should be rational. And so, for it to be rational, they answer to questions like that. Obviously, people have ideas in their minds of why you wouldn't choose the king or the dictator. But why not the people? They, after all, would know their own needs the best. But the point given there, so I am a Democrat, and so is Bartley, and so is Popper, and so is the rest. But if you think that the people are capable of making the best decisions for themselves, well, this is an authoritarianism of a kind. Not in the strictest of sense, but what makes you think that they're capable of being rational? What makes you think they're more rational than the king or the dictator? The real point of this is not that people can make their own decisions, or they should make their own decisions, and the best people to do so is if you even look at the question in this way of who should rule, well, you find yourself in a place of saying they are the most rational people, they are most capable. And none of that stands to reason. You could have a democracy tomorrow that makes tremendous mistakes and consistently makes tremendous mistakes, and a dictatorship that doesn't. There's nothing within the principle itself, once you ask who should rule, that answers this question for you, unless you change the question itself, which is from who should rule to how can we best arrange our political institutions to get rid of bad leaders. Now, I think Deutsch or Popper have added to the end of that as quickly as possible and without violence, but that's not something that Bartley has here. I'm sure it's implied, though. The real value in this is that it reformulates the question in a way that opens the door to a rational approach to the issue, enables someone to be a political rationalist as well as a Democrat without committing themselves to the belief that this one will produce better or truer outcomes. The reason you would want a democracy as opposed to the others is simply because the ballot box is the most effective mechanism that we know of for getting rid of those bad leaders. The ballot box themselves, as you've seen in a lot of recent elections, are open for criticism and challenge, and people will do this, and the courts will hear those challenges. The whole thing is as open as possible. And at the end of each term, people are removed and changed again, and the process can continue. What's valuable is the process, not the particular ideas that individuals have in any given political cycle. The reframing of this question in a way that matters is a reframing of the problem. And that is, it's not really to figure out who in advance should have the political power in their hands, who should be an infallible political source. Really, it's an insurance mechanism. We're expecting bad things to happen. We're expecting poor leaders to come into power. We're expecting mistakes and political failures and policy failures. And we're taking out insurance. And democracy is that insurance. It's our way to right the ship when it all goes wrong. And importantly in this, what happens is you find yourself looking at political authority, political power, the whole political system, as justification free. No one has a justified right to anything. And nothing, no policy, no decision is ever justified. And if you wind this back to philosophy and to critical rationalism, you can see the obvious connection. Instead of searching for a philosophical justification for what we want or the decisions we make, really the game is to open those decisions up and the theories we create to criticism. Nothing gets justified, everything gets criticized, and hopefully we'll discover our mistakes as fast as possible. And what Bartley is imagining here is something Popper speaks about too, which is he imagines an ecological niche for rationality itself, a culture surrounding it, not a thing itself, but a large mechanism, a program for counteracting intellectual error wherever it happens. Now, when Bartley gets going here, and he's just about to now, and push himself away from Popper, is, I think, the real implication of all of this, is that if nothing is justified and no one has a right to any particular thing, and no one, of course, can foresee the future, then we must learn from our mistakes, which is what critical rationalism is all about. We must search for those mistakes wherever they are, find them however we can, and move on from them and improve upon them. The real point is we can't know what they are in advance. They're unforeseen, they're unanticipated, and in most cases that's what we're going to be dealing with. Hopefully along the way we pose ever more challenging problems and probing questions, and we discover more and more of the mistakes we've made. It's a process that can't be preempted, and if you're a rationalist, it's a program where you are following their corrections wherever they may lead, not towards a direction that you've already decided they ought to be leading towards. Bartley goes back into a deep history of philosophy here, and with that claim that the critical rationalists often think is theirs, which is something along the lines of you must be critical, always be critical, search for criticism. And he goes back and looks at the pre-Socratics and Socrates and Descartes and Kant and Nietzsche, and he goes to show that this is a central part of all their philosophies. In fact, we look around, even in Bartley's day, which, he died, a long time ago now, 1970s, 80s, I believe. If you look around, the idea of a critical attitude, there's nothing fresh about it. It's rather an old story. We ought to be critical. And most people accept this. It's just that for most people out there, and this is where Bartley is pointing at Popper and the critical rationalists, they think there's a fundamental limit to what rationality can be. So a fundamental limit to what criticism ought to be, where it can reach into and where it can't. And this is where the title of his book comes from, The Retreat to Commitment. Bartley goes on to say that this is an ultimate commitment that everyone makes, except for him, which he's going to try and explain to us. And this is a point that's been slightly hashed out in the previous two episodes I did in this series. But most people out there, when they talk about criticism and they realize there's a limit to their own criticism, the first thing they do when people show this to them is they recognize the limit within other people's criticism, other people's theory of rationality. This is the tu quoque argument, which is looking at the other person and saying, you're doing exactly the same thing that I am. Sure, I'm limiting the scope of my rationality. So are you. So is everyone. So are the critical rationalists. So is Karl Popper. And the mistake boils down to this, which is in almost all these histories, the way we understand philosophy, the traditions that exist in modern philosophy, whenever you see criticism as an idea, and all those famous names I just mentioned there, it's always been fused with the idea of justificationism, rather than an escape from it. Obvious examples of this are things like logical deduction, or how it's commonly understood, or to Hume's appeal to sensory experience, or to similarities with Descartes. What comprehensive rationalism is, the forebearer to critical rationalism, is an attempt to say something is true or not by justification to that existing standard. So if you decide that deductive logic works a certain way, and then you criticize things that don't live up to that standard, well, it's a justification. Your criticism, though valid, maybe it is, but is a criticism in relationship to a rational criteria that you've already accepted. And it's rational criteria you've already accepted, which itself is not exposed to rationality or criticism. It can't be. If you want to make the appeal to sensory experience, it's the same thing. Sensory experience gives us truth, or gives us access to the truth. So if you want to go on and criticize mistakes that are made, the mistakes will be in light of the fact that they weren't properly derived from sensory experience. How does sensory experience give us truth? Well, it's not answered. It explicitly sits beyond rationality. I mean, not answered is fine, but to say that I don't need to answer it, or it wouldn't make any sense to answer it, which is what Bartley is eventually going to accuse Popper of here, is a different measure altogether. The same thing goes to Descartes' reductionism. Reduce things down and run the reductive analysis, and somehow you get clear and distinct ideas where you can build up from. How do you get clear and distinct ideas from reductionism? It's not explained, and it's deliberately not explained. There's a principle here. Some people may still be doubting this, but there's a principle here that Bartley calls an elastic clause. And he says it's similar to what you find in the American Constitution, the US Constitution. And it goes something like this. What matters is not whether a belief can be derived from a rational authority, but whether it conflicts with it. It sounds like an improvement, right? And I suppose it is, in a way. But it is still horribly justificationist. One way you say that a belief is true if I can derive it from this existing principle. It sounds nice. But, of course, it's obviously wrong for most rationalists out there. Well, people who are not comprehensive rationalists. But if you then want to say, I engage in criticism, and I want to criticize the world, and you go on to say that a belief is wrong because it conflicts with an original principle that I have, well, it's not much better, right? Either way, it's the original thing you hold on to, which is imposing itself on everything else that you think. And everything else gets compared, whether it's true or false, by light of that original principle. It is justificationism. It's a bit like beginning with the Bible, as Bartley does in some of his analogies here, and then watching the onset of Newtonian theory, some of Newtonian theory. Now, if you did hold your original principle as what comes from the Bible is true, and the Word of God and all the rest, if you hold that as your starting point, you may decide after some analysis that Newtonian theory is compatible with the Bible. If it is, it's justificationism. You say it's true because it is compatible with the Bible. If you discover that it's not, and you think it conflicts, you say it is false because it conflicts with the Bible. Now, when you hear it like this, you think this may not be a problem that affects all else in epistemology and philosophy. But Bartley thinks the opposite. He thinks it affects everything, including critical rationalism. That every time criticism comes along and people talk about the value of criticism and what it can do, they are always fusing it with justificationism. And a lot of it, or all of it, tends to hinge back to that idea that you are starting with an irrational commitment. And then when you start with the irrational commitment, whatever that commitment may be, you then hold in other truths compatible with it or incompatible with it, and justifying that in that way. Now, the degrees in which who came up with what in this, how much Bartley is to blame and how much Popper is to blame. Blame is the wrong word there, of course, for building up the story, as I've said. Of course, the criticism that Bartley has of Popper must be all Bartley's, but some of that authoritarian structure of philosophy was clearly Popper's. But none of that really matters. What matters is that there's a dilemma hanging in the air, and it goes in three parts. First, is it possible within a justificational or authoritarian theory of knowledge to resolve this dilemma of ultimate commitment, this commitment to an original irrational principle? And then, is there an alternative, non-justificational, non-authoritarian approach, which is possible within philosophy? And then finally, within a non-justificational approach, is it possible to resolve the dilemma of ultimate commitment? Is it even achievable? And I think it's that last point that Popper disagrees with. And it's that last point that Bartley's going to hinge on here and dig into and build pancritical rationalism out of.